Being recorded.
Please go ahead.
Great. Okay. So thanks everyone for bearing with us there through some technical difficulties, but hopefully now everybody can see my screen there. So I'll jump right into it. I got about 15 minutes to make up. So this book, 17 Key Traits of Data Literacy, this book is all about trying to help people understand what it means to be highly data literate. And I think I'm going to have to ask you, Sagar, to advance the slides then, I suppose. So if you could do that, appreciate it. Okay, great. So, and I think you can maybe switch from scroll mode to presentation mode there, if you like. Or we'll just go with it. We'll scroll if we have to scroll. Okay, so that's me right there, Ben Jones. I have been running a business called Data Literacy LLC for the last year. Prior to that, I was at Tableau running Tableau Public, where I published communicating data with Tableau with O'Reilly, and more recently avoiding data pitfalls here, and that started shipping in the United States last month. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a slide of me and my three boys. That's Aaron and Simon, and we really like to hike and backpack around the Pacific Northwest, this beautiful area around Seattle where we live. And what I realized as I was moving up here from Los Angeles a few years ago to join Tableau and spending time with my boys on the trail as well, that you know, what I was surrounded by was kind of beautiful visuals, right? So visuals of nature, visuals on my screen with dashboards and things like that that people were creating all around the world. I was running the Tableau Public platform. So I saw that analogy there, you know, taking in these amazing sights with our eyes. And if you can advance to the next slide. And then I began to sort of appreciate the fact that oftentimes on the trail, what you're doing is you're on a journey to a higher place. And so this is the two of them as they go up this particularly interesting little section of a trail outside of Seattle on the way to a waterfall. And that if we continue to advance, the next you know, kind of realization was that this is really a journey of adoption, because when I came here, I really was not into hiking or backpacking. That was not anything that I knew how to do or had any skill or familiarity with. And that I saw people also looking to adopt analytics and visualization in their own situations. And then just kind of seeing the analogy there that, you know, in both scenarios, you start with an awareness of the alternatives, what's possible, you know, what are the ways you can go about partaking or participating in a given activity, whatever it may be. So before you adopt that activity as your own, there needs to be some awareness of what it means to do that. And you maybe hear about it or talk about something with someone else who does a certain activity, or you read about it. Okay, so then our journey of adoption of data and analytics is very much the same thing. It starts with understanding what is, becoming aware of what's possible. Okay, so if we move to the next slide. So then, you know, this is really the basis of the framework I'm using to teach people data and analytics, that there's a journey that we go on to a higher place, like a stair-step analogy, just like my boys on the trail. And this involves using data to build in our wisdom, that is, our ability to know which actions to take. And that's ultimately, you know, data's most powerful use for us in our environment. If you go to the next slide also here, that's comparing to back in the 1980s, you know, what other kind of massive technology adoptions have we seen over our lifetime? I was a child growing up in the 80s. And if you look at this little advertisement I found from CompuLit, you can see how you can use a word processing program in just 4 or 5 hours. And so there's a seminar that people can take. Look, it says it's for students and secretaries and writers and business people who are using word processing. Now, nobody really, you know, gets much training these days for word processing or even talks about that being on their resume. But that was a massive wave of adoption in the 80s, wasn't it? And if we zoom ahead to the next slide, this is a photo of my father right here. And I remember going into his little store. It was a computer store in the Los Angeles area. And he would have those little, you know, books and courses and actually VHS tapes on the shelf about how you can get good at working with, you know, a word processing software application. So that was a wave that my father saw. And then zooming ahead to the 90s when I was in college at UCLA, well, lo and behold, this internet thing takes off. And so there we go. And so look, what I found there is a video called Video Professor, okay, that allows you to learn to use the internet. And you can buy that tape and stick it in your VHS and watch a TV show that talks about how you can learn to use the internet. So this is this massive adoption in the 90s, people all around the world very rapidly adopting the internet. If you go to the next slide, we'll see a screenshot, I believe, of Netscape Navigator. There's one of the very first software applications written to help people navigate the internet, right? So those are the early days. Those are the early days. People didn't know what it was. They didn't understand the meaning of connecting on the internet and what that entailed. And so they started with becoming aware of it. Then they took various steps to adopt. And if we go to the next one, I thought about it, what happens after 2000? Well, now all of a sudden we get these social media platforms all around us. And so a large part of what we were doing there was trying to learn how to use the Facebook, and what does this mean to be on Facebook, and what do I put there, and how do I connect with people? Why would I do that? And what about these other social media products, Twitter and now LinkedIn? So in the 2000s, the first decade of this next millennium, people all around the world tried to adopt social media as a way to connect with one another. So those were massive technological waves of adoption over the last few decades. And right now, if you zoom ahead, where we are since I think about 2010 and beyond, is adopting and a massive technological wave of adoption of data. And so we're seeing tools like Tableau and others come out to help people make better use of all of their data. Now, this is requiring us to be data literate in a whole new way, a way that wasn't the case in those earlier waves of adoption that I was referring to. And so, now we do, and it's not just data analysts that need to be highly data literate. It's everyone. We all interact with charts and graphs and dashboards on a very regular basis now, not just in our professional lives, but also personal lives and in the communities in which we live. And there's data about all those topics and ways in which we need to connect. And so then I started asking myself, well, what does it mean to be data literate? What is data literacy? And I really like the Wikipedia definition, actually, which you can see on the screen here. And that is the ability to read, understand, create, and communicate data as information. So 4 things: reading, understanding, creating, and communicating. Similar to literacy in terms of the human languages that we speak. We need to be able to listen and understand. We need to be able to speak and respond. We need to be able to write. Those are all aspects of literacy in the traditional sense. Applying that to data now, we need to be able to understand visuals, even raw data, processing it, finding out what's there, communicating that back to the people around us, helping them understand what's happening, and having a dialogue. And so around the data, and that's what data literacy is all about. So if you zoom ahead, I tried to think about what it meant to be highly data literate. And so this quote really just speaks to, and this is at the beginning of the ebook that I'll send to you all, but the idea here is that, we're trying to figure out what it means to be highly data literate. And not only, and it's just becoming such an important question to answer, just because of the fact that, we are surrounded by and required to make effective use of data on a daily basis. So if we zoom ahead, that's just a quick little quote. We're going to see quotes from 4 other people on the presentation, people that I reached out to collaborate to create this ebook, people that I have a lot of respect for and admire, and chose them for the section that they'll provide the quote for it. So there are 17 key traits, and there's the icons you can see here, but that's a lot of things to remember. And so in order to help break it down and make it easier to digest, if you go to the next slide, thank you, you'll see that I decided to group these 17 traits into 4 categories. And I think when most people think about data literacy, they think about it in terms of skills, maybe for those of us who are analysts, who analyze data on a regular basis. If you say, oh, is this person good at working, good at data? Okay, if I just use like a generic term like that, what would someone say? Oh, I think that means that they probably can use Tableau or Python, or they have SQL skills or Excel skills or something like that. They say, oh, that's what that means for them to be highly data literate. In other words, they're thinking about it in terms of skills. Oftentimes, I think in the consuming side, people who are consuming large amounts of data, They probably more think about it in terms of knowledge, like, do I know what that chart means? Do I understand the concept of average or standard deviation? So the top row gets a lot of love in the data literacy space, knowledge and skills. Well, what I try to do to round it out is add in attitudes and behaviors, because I believe that those top two rows, the top two categories in the first row, knowledge and skills, should lead to us thinking and feeling a certain way about data, and then acting in certain ways in teams. And so attitudes and behaviors became pretty much half of the equation for this ebook. Okay, so we'll talk about each one of those one by one. Let's move ahead to the first section here about knowledge. So, yes, absolutely. When we talk about data literacy, what it means to be highly data literate, there's things we need to know. There's concepts, there's ideas, there's principles, there's even just simply facts that we need to have in retention in our mind. And that's a body of knowledge that we have to onboard and become familiar with it, and then hopefully teach. So the very first one, if we move ahead, is all about understanding. I'm sorry, I chose Alberto Cairo there, someone who seems to me to have a wide array of knowledge about this field and about ways to communicate data well. So Alberto says that working with data requires a certain degree of numerical and graphical literacy, respectively called numeracy and graphicacy. Numeracy isn't just math, stats, or logic, but a sixth sense that is grounded in a grasp, even a tenuous one, of fundamental concepts of those areas. Okay. Graphicacy, on the other hand, consists of developing intuition of what kinds of graphs, charts, or maps are more adequate to either explore our data or communicate the main insights we obtain to other people. So this is a great quote to me to kick off the knowledge section, and also just to call attention to the fact that he mentions this sixth sense in there, that there's an intuitive component to the knowledge we have about working with data. Sometimes we can't even necessarily put our finger on why we know something or why we feel we should be thinking about or doing something. That can oftentimes come from a part of our mind that we don't necessarily have full access of, that, some kind of a voice, an intuitive voice. So I like that he paid respect to that. It isn't just about rote memorization and encyclopedic knowledge. It's really about a familiarity and a grasp, a human one. Okay, so let's move ahead and talk about the first of the 17 key traits. Basic elements of data. So, if you're a highly data literate person, you understand the difference between variable types, whether those are date and time types or whether they're quantitative variables, maybe those that are differentiated by the fact that some have an absolute zero and others don't, and what does that mean to how I can work with them. And so these are just basic concepts that you grasp, and so it starts with that. If you think about it in terms of the language analogy, this would really be kind of being familiar with letters and consonants and vowels. This would be being familiar with how that basic atomic structure and where it comes from. And I believe that that's important. It's hard to really make much sense out of data if we don't really have a firm grasp of the kinds of elements that are included and involved in there. So, that's important to know. And I think there's been some helpful documents that have been written that help us kind of learn about that. People over the last 100 years or so that have tried to define what it means to be working with certain kinds of variables. And the people who laid the groundwork for that did so out of necessity because people were not agreeing on how to work with data in their day and age. I'm thinking of researchers that were doing experiments where they were comparing notes with their colleagues and they were not coming to an agreement. People like Stanley Smith Stevens at Harvard, who was studying how human beings perceive sound, the loudness of noises, and realizing that no one was ever agreeing on how to do the analysis and how to answer some of those basic questions. So he wrote a foundational paper in 1946 in which he laid out four basic variables that we've been talking about that ever since. And it's not a perfect typology, but I think it's a helpful one in a lot of ways. If we go to the next slide. So also, it isn't just about that, right? But a question is, where is it? What kind of data are we talking about? Is this empirical data, observations about the real world? Is this abstract data from mathematical formulas or algorithms? Or are we talking about metadata here, which is data about our data, something that we always appreciate when we have a thorough set of metadata, which I think is why it's called a love note to the future, because if you're diligent enough to collect it well, then people down the road for months and years ahead will appreciate that there's that much information about the data itself for them to know what it is that it says and maybe perhaps doesn't say. So next slide, please. But this is Stevens, who I was mentioning, Stanley Smith Stevens, and his 4 data scale type. And it spells NOIR, which, as you know, is also noir, being Pinot Noir, being a type of red wine. And he mentioned these 4 different types of variables. N for nominal, these are just names of things. O for ordinal, where you have a category that has a certain order to it, like an Olympic medal or a shirt size, small, medium, or large. And then there's interval variable types that don't have an absolute zero, a zero meaning nothing, like Fahrenheit or Celsius, where 0 is more an arbitrary level. And there's certain things we can do with those variables and certain things we can't. And then finally, ratio variable types, weight, height, revenue. These have a meaningful 0, where 0 means nothing. And oftentimes physical properties of the real world. And this is, in some ways, the most powerful type of variable because of how much we can do quantitatively and analytically with that exact variable type. So again, just helpful to understand that, okay? So if we move ahead here to, I believe, hopefully the second trait here. Oh, yeah, this was just a silly joke I saw on Reddit where, you know, using a variable in a different way than it was meant. So, you know, the Windows type, okay, if it's Windows 95 or 2000 or Windows 10, well, that isn't a quantitative variable in the sense that you wouldn't think to make a chart looking at the quantities there, right? So it's treating a nominal variable, the label of the, I suppose actually you could say an ordinal variable since they occur in time. But you know, we wouldn't want to treat that as a ratio variable type. That's an example of what happens when you get that part of it wrong. Yeah, okay, let's move ahead here. So we can skip this one. Just to say there's other typologies as well, you know, and it isn't just as simple as saying, well, those 4, that is it. There's other thinkers like John Tukey and others who have kind of gone further to defining different variable types that we work with. And you can take a look at that if you'd like. Okay, so next slide here, onto type skill or knowledge trait number 2. So, you know, knowing that a variable is a certain kind of type is helpful, but ultimately we need to store variables, don't we? We need to store data, and that goes in many places. And so someone who is highly data literate, you know, understands the difference between places you can put data, how you can structure it. What does it mean to be in a spreadsheet versus in a database? What does it mean to be in the cloud versus on premises? What does it mean to be a summary table versus a raw list of records? You know, what about some of these newer forms of data collection and storage that are unstructured? So that's, you know, a realm that frankly I'm not really familiar with. I mean, at a basic level, yes, but there are people who, data engineers, database administrators, their entire career is around understanding many, many nuances of data storage methods. If we can go to the next slide. Here's just a simple graphic that kind of illustrates the different forms and places. And this is a whole field in and of itself, isn't it? So, you know, I think for all of us that are working with data, it's helpful to be at least on a high level familiar with what these are and what the differences between them are. For someone who's a you know, highly professional data engineer, then they're going to have a deeper level of knowledge. So I don't think everybody needs to be a professional or an expert in the nuances of every one of these different and many more different types of data storage, but it is helpful to understand at a basic level, yeah, like what they mean, okay, to be highly data literate. Okay, next skill here is, oh yeah, this is just kind of really helping us understand the difference between structure types, right? So some tables are summary tables. We can then pivot them if you go down to the next slide to see what that looks like. Yeah, so because it's a PDF, we can't show the builds, unfortunately. But anyway, you know, kind of understanding the difference between a table or a grid and a list is a good, you know, kind of thing to understand. Okay, we can go ahead to the third one here, which is our data analysis principles. So we analyze data, right? So we need to be able to make sense of that. There's 5 different types of data analysis. You're talking diagnostic, descriptive, inferential, diagnostic, predictive, prescriptive. And each one of those types of analysis involves different principles, do's and do nots, if you will, best practices. And so, being able to really analyze data well involves familiarity with that. So if we zoom ahead here to the next slide. Yeah, I was just kind of in this one, NFL players might not be something that everyone in the room is listening is familiar with, but if we take a list of players of a sport and we were to look at their variables and talk about the averages in terms of their height or their age or their weight or their salary, how much they make. And we talked about them just in terms of the averages would be obviously a descriptive statistic about each of those players. And then, those averages might tell us different things based on the shape of the distribution, as we can see here. Age, height, weight, and salary have very different shapes when we look at them in terms of their histograms. And so then analyzing those players and what it means to have one of those different properties is something that's very different based on the distribution of the variable itself. So that's just an example of, not being familiar with analysis principles and what that means. Next slide. We can see interesting shapes like the weight of the player, and why we see that kind of a shape, if you go to the next slide, is because different players have different body types based on the role they play on the field and what it is that they're being asked to do. Next slide here. So fourth trait, and this is the final one that I've included in the knowledge section, is that data visualization rules of thumb are really important. And I think that, the reason why Tableau hired people like Jock McKinley early on in the history of the company is because they realized very wisely that it's good to understand exactly how data needs to be visualized and how the human mind makes sense of data in visual form. And there tends to be some rules of thumb there that we often follow, not always, but often. And sometimes these are broken for a good reason, but primarily, kind of following the rules of thumb of data visualization is a helpful thing to think about. If you go to the next slide here, you'll see that we can take an example being, we oftentimes show time increasing from left to right in Western culture, and oftentimes, kind of in other areas as well. We typically think about time progressing on a straight line, going from left to right. It's a convention. It doesn't have to be that way. We can create visualizations that are different than that. But we know for sure that a shortcut to our audience's understanding is to show time showing in that way. And another couple examples of data visualization rules of thumb, if you go to the next slide, would be needing to look carefully about y-axes that are cropped. So the previous build on this slide shows a version of this exact bar chart where the y-axis is truncated, and it looks like the tax amounts are about to just dramatically increase. And so being aware of that, being able to understand that, this is going to give our audience a certain impression that might be misleading to them. We need to be careful about that. Another rule of thumb there to watch out for y-axes. And again, there are times where we would use a y-axis that does not start at 0. But in general, we want to watch out for that. And if you go to the next slide here, an example of, this is going to be very difficult for a human being to make sense of. So many slices in a pie chart, so many colors. It's very overwhelming, for most people to encounter a chart like this. And so, every software program out there will, that allows you to make pie charts will let you make this. And so the question is just, you as a practitioner, do you know that these certain types of visualizations are going to be difficult for people to understand? Okay, let's go to the next slide here. So 3 dimensions, 3D, something that Tableau doesn't do, many other software products in BI also, but some still do. And we know that 3D can be misleading. Why? Because it gives additional prominence to the slices that happen to be in the foreground, and it tends to diminish the overall perceived importance of slices in the background. Like this one right here. Look at A and C. On the left-hand side in the 3-dimensional version, they look about the same. But if you look at it on the right-hand side in the 2-dimensional version, you see that the blue slice is actually twice as big, more than twice as big, in fact. And so we need to watch out for that. Okay, next slide. I really love this, and a lot of my training is in my first level 1, which is about reading and interpreting data visualizations, is based on this work of Tamara Munzner in Vancouver, and she created there's an effectiveness list of encodings and helping us understand the ones at the top there, like position and length. Those are ones that human beings are able to make good guesses about the relative proportions that they're showing. And the lower down the list you go, the more difficult it is for us to have an accurate guess. So it's good to understand those principles. Next slide. So then it isn't just knowing things, right? So it would be one thing if we just knew and had, all this knowledge, that would be great. But ultimately, we need to put it into practice by doing things. So skills are a list of things that highly data literate people know how to do. We go to the next slide. So an example there would be, oh, I love this quote from R.J. Andrews. R.J. is the author of Info We Trust, and he's a person who, in my opinion, has a high degree of skill in working with data, many different software programs and platforms and techniques he's mastered. So he talks about how this act of working with data, rolling up our sleeves really and getting into it helps us to have a new sense of appreciation for what it is that's emerging from the data. So it's a real great quote. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a photograph, I believe, of his book, Info We Trust. And he's holding it up there in front of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco where he lives. It's a great book. I recommend you get it. Right here on my bookshelf. Yeah. Okay, so go to the next one here. So I found this article. So, there's a lot of software products, aren't there? So many to use. This is a 6 must-have skills for data analysts, according to an article on Northeastern, which is a university here in the United States. So SQL, Excel, critical thinking, R or Python, Tableau, and then presentation skills. Those are the things that at least a year ago, one blogger, writer felt were absolutely necessary for anyone who's going to be analyzing data on a regular basis. You may agree or disagree, or you may add or subtract from this list, but I think it's a pretty good one. If we go to the next slide, so those are a lot of skills, right? That's a lot of things to learn. Well, we need to be able to read visual displays of data. We need to be able to take data that's presented in chart or graph form that others have created for us and consume it and understand what it's saying rapidly, knowing what to watch out for, knowing what questions to ask. There's so many different types of charts and graphs. If you go to the next slide, we can see, an example of an interactive dashboard. This was built in Tableau that helps people understand the growth of the population of the world by region and where people live around the world. Being able to see this and not be intimidated by this, be able to say, I've got what it takes to understand what this is telling me. That's a critical skill in today's environment. That's necessary, right? If you go to the next slide, we'll see that we can't just, though, merely rely on interpreting visuals that others have created. And that's because there could be errors in there. There could be perhaps agendas that someone might have. Isn't necessarily even just malicious. Like it might just be that they simply, had a problem with the data somewhere along the way. So it's important for us as we increase in our levels of data literacy to be able to work with raw data ourselves. And part of that, as you all know, is involving preparing data for analysis, because data rarely comes to us in pristine, clean, perfect form. Structured the way we need to be structured to answer the questions we want to answer. So oftentimes we do need to prepare data for analysis. Next slide. So I found a fun example of this. So there's a city here in the United States, in Maryland, the state of Maryland is Baltimore. I spent a little bit of time there this year actually working for the US government, but there's a data set that shows over 60,000 cars that are vehicles being towed in the city. And I believe what's happening is there's handwritten forms for the tow truck driver to give to the yard that they're entering that data into a computer system. Now the data is available online for anybody to go download and see. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that if we try to find out which kind of cars got towed the most, we see that this list starts with Honda and Ford and Chevrolet and Toyota. But if we go down lower, we see Toyota in all caps and Honda in all caps and Ford in all caps. So we have some different cases, lowercase, uppercase. But it isn't just that. It's actually almost 900 different makes in this data set of 61,000 tows. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that This includes some really interesting values, like 4 different ways, many ways of spelling the card Ford, including some that are quite silly. Next slide. Also some ways to spell the truck Peterbilt. It's a semi-truck. And some humorous ones that I was able to discover in there. Also the next slide, Mitsubishi, but sometimes with a T at the end, maybe. I'm not sure what that would pronounce that, but you get the point. And then the next one, I even saw the presence of a variable called burnt car in the car make there. So obviously some interesting situations for tow truck drivers out there to have to deal with. But this is dirty data. So it's hard for us to answer the question, even a simple question, what's the most common make that was towed when we have dirty data like this. So what was the result of all this? I took about half an hour to clean up the values. Did you know there was actually 36 different ways of spelling Volkswagen in that list? So many different ways. I think people commonly get it wrong. Next slide. So then what's the result of all this cleaning that I spent a good half an hour, 45 minutes cleaning it all up? On the left-hand side, that was my original. And then I think if we go to the next one, hopefully we'll be able to see the right-hand one. Yeah, good. So you can see Volkswagen, because it was misspelled so many different ways, goes from the 26th place up to the 11th place. And you can see even values like Honda and Ford. Look at that, Toyota and Chevrolet actually switch places. So Toyota actually leapfrogs over Chevy to become the third most common. And so, this is an interesting situation for us because, actually, yeah, cleaning the data did make a difference. It did have an effect on what we would assume to be the most common make that was towed. So again, would we have known that if someone just showed us the first chart they made? Maybe they didn't know to clean it. Maybe they didn't realize there were this many errors. All they showed perhaps was the top 5 and then they were done. And so being able to dig in and clean up and figure out what's going on in the data, it's an important skill. Next slide. Oh yeah, these are 4 common data prep steps. I actually, I love Tableau Prep. I use it all the time now. It's a common, I almost use it every day actually, just because I find so often I need to do these things in order to be able to work effectively with data. And it does these well. You can pivot and restructure your data. You can go in and clean dirty data. Some powerful algorithms in there to clean up data. We can create unions and joins very easily using visual techniques. So many powerful tools now coming out to be able to help us make adjustments to the data itself. Next slide. So then once we are presenting data, preparing it rather, the next thing is we need to be able to explore it. So like gold in a mine, insights aren't going to reveal themselves without effort. We have to chip away. We have to apply a lot of sometimes, like our own effort to be able to see what's there. So if you go to the next slide, exploring data just becomes such a powerful thing that we need to do. So maps, these are maps of the world, as you know, obviously. They have one thing in common, and they're missing something. They're all missing the same thing. And maybe you can tell right away. But it turns out what they're all missing is New Zealand. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see there's an entire page dedicated to maps without New Zealand. It turns out they oftentimes, that set of 2 islands there gets left out of the world map quite often. And so out of respect for New Zealand, I would like to tell a story about New Zealand if you go to the next slide. So New Zealand, when it was first discovered by a European navigator, explorer, it was in 1642, and the explorer's name was Abel Tasman. And he happened to be the first European to discover New Zealand. And, there were the Maori people living there at the time. They had been living there for many years. But he was the first European navigator, explorer to come across New Zealand. Now, he mistakenly thought that it was a single island. And he named this area in the middle that you see this notch. He called this Zehaynes Bight. And a bight, I didn't know what it was. I had to look it up. A bight is a crescent shape in a contour, like in a coastline. And I'm showing in the bottom right-hand corner, that's where I grew up in Los Angeles. You can see this crescent shape between Los Angeles and San Diego. So he thought that area in between those islands was just a bight. He didn't think that there was any way to get through. But then a little over 100 years later, if you go to the next slide, James Cook was the second European to come across these islands. in 1769. And he did a complete circumnavigation of these pairs of islands. And he called the area in between there Cook Strait, because a strait is a navigable waterway, as you know, right? Water that passes between a narrow passageway. And so that's what it's called today, Cook Strait. It's not called Zeehane's Bight. And so, the lesson there is that being able to thoroughly explore our data is important. And we'll miss important aspects or details if we don't proceed carefully and thoroughly and with caution. In the next slide, I came up with these 10 questions that I think are helpful to look at a data set before we start to explore it. Things like, what's the granularity of that data? What does a single record mean? What are the rows? How many are there, right? How many variables are there? What are the types of variables? Is one of them unique? What are the mins and maxes of each of the quantitative variables, and what are their shapes? What are the levels? Are there hierarchies in the data? Do we see any nulls in there? And so, knowing these questions before we start to ask and answer questions of our data is very important, because it might help us understand a little more about what it is that the data contains and what it doesn't contain, some quirky nuances about it perhaps that might cause us to take a different approach when we work with it. Okay, next slide. So yeah, exploring the contours of our data is super important. Creating clear visuals. So, we need to be able to know how to make charts, graphs, maps, and dashboards that other people understand. I mean, this to me is the aspect of data literacy which speaks to how articulate are we. We're actually now speaking, communicating. We're the ones that's giving the information to others. How do you design, craft, and publish visuals that other people are going to take notice of, understand, and remember? Next slide. So we're a little over halfway there. So many visuals, right? This is the Financial Times, their wonderful visual vocabulary, which you can see online. They put out there in the public domain this amazing set of collection of visualizations that grouped by what their primary purpose is. So this is a lot of different, think of it like, in order to have a mastery of a language, you have to learn a lot of words and phrases and the meanings of those phrases in order to be able to communicate with others. Same thing with data. Next slide. And again, going back to Tamara Munzner's chart, I feel this is such an important foundational cornerstone for working with data, understanding the rankings of these encoding types, and then understanding how these different chart types are using them. All a chart type is, let's say a bar chart, what is that doing? Well, it's encoding a quantity with length, and it's spacing out different bars or columns based on the category that each one of the records falls into. So understanding kind of how those different chart types are built, it isn't like the chart type itself is the most, the smallest level of atom, if you will. It's like a molecule in the physical world, that connection. And then what is a molecule made up of, right? Atoms made up of electrons, protons, neutrons. Same thing, charts and graphs are made up of the data elements themselves and their encodings. These ones right here. Next slide. Just being able to create effective, clear visuals is so important. But then also, just making charts and graphs is not really the only thing, right? Next thing we need to do is kind of piece them together sometimes into a narrative, some type of, as we call, sometimes you hear the term, a data story. This is essentially something that we put together to create a compelling presentation of the data. And it goes beyond just making a clear chart, doesn't it? It really does. It involves taking people on a journey sometimes in a presentation, whether that be something we're delivering live like I'm doing right now, or maybe it's a video, or maybe it's a blog post or an article or a report we write that helps convey a series perhaps, or a sequence of data facts laid out in either simple statistics and facts and figures or charts and graphs, and being able to tell those data. Hans Rosling, the late Swedish public health professional, academic, as well as doctor, as well as, I would say, data guru, took communicating data to a whole different level with some of his YouTube videos that really kind of connect with us emotionally. So being able to communicate effectively. Next slide, please. So let's take an example. Let's say I want to talk about countries around the world and how effective they are at converting to sustainable forms of energy like wind, solar. Next slide. We could just create what I would call a spaghetti chart in any analytics package. And if I were to use this as my compelling presentation to you about how countries have changed in their usage of renewable energy, it wouldn't be a very effective presentation. I would not have communicated well to you. You would walk away puzzled more than enlightened. But nowadays with tools, if you go to the next slide, we can actually create compelling data stories, whether that's with story points in Tableau. This is what happens to me right here with Flourish. I can have a play button. I can even upload an audio file where I talk about this change and I play through the data and I really bring it to life for you in a completely different way. That to me is a whole different level of communication and skill that people are perfecting now. Next slide, please. And I developed these 8 data story types, which to me are powerful ways to help people see interesting findings within the data, like seeing how variables changing over time, or drilling down in a hierarchy from a high level of the hierarchy to a lower level, or maybe zooming in and out of a map, showing contrasts like the extreme, most, or least, intersections showing where one phenomenon passes or crosses another, factors breaking down something into its component parts, outliers looking for those elements that are dramatically different from their peers, their neighbors, those in their category, and then correlating, seeing how variables are changing together. These are data story types we can usually put into simple 3 or 4 or 5 set slide presentations that really get people to take note and pay attention. Why? Because they trigger interesting questions for us in the audience. If you're showing me the most in the contrasts, I want to know what's in the least and why is there such a dramatic difference between those extremes, right? If you're talking to me about intersections, I really want to know why one thing passed another in value over time. And then, of course, outliers. I'm drawn to understanding what is that element that is so dramatically different from everything else, and why? Why is it so different? So it creates it really engages with the audience's curiosity. And so, that's a book I'm working on right now, the 8 data story types that I hope to come out with at some point next year. Okay, next slide. So attitudes to me kind of are oftentimes missed or left out. And this is so important though, right? How do we think and feel about data? That can be such an important aspect of our data literacy as we develop and as we grow in our skills and abilities, also then changing the way we think and feel about data. Next slide. So an example would be that someone who's highly data literate, and this is Georgia Lupi's comment about it. What I love about Georgia, as you know, the author of Dear Data, she's at Pentagram now, and she ran the data studio Accurate for many years. But she talks about the fact that a key attitude about data is that it's human in a sense, and it's imperfect in many senses, and that's an important feeling to have about data, knowing that there are some aspects of it that may not be perfect. Next slide, please. And so then one thing that highly data literate people are is they're inclusive. So this means that they include others in their conversation, and they have the attitude that everyone is capable of participating in the dialogue, and that if there's someone that's being left out of it, they try to draw them in. This is a team sport, having conversations together, regardless of your background, your education, your level in the company. Those things don't matter. Next slide. We all know that we have, as human beings, this ability to notice certain things when data is shown to us. This is this is universal. We can all spot the red dot in the charts here. This is something that, if you go to the next slide, right, our visual cortex, these are preattentive attributes. And these different things we see, everybody, you can see it without even knowing, and without even applying yourself to understanding it. Next slide, please. More preattentive attributes, things that just pop off the screen at us. Everyone's like this. It's not that someone who went to a certain school sees it and those who didn't go to that elite school don't, right? People, everyone from the executive, the CEO to the janitor, we all see these things. And so we can have a conversation together. And so that's so important to be inclusive when we think about including others in a data dialogue, because here's our visual cortex. You know, these are things that as we take in information visually, this information passes through to our primary visual cortex all the way in the back of our brain, and then it's processed. And so this is the way we process visual information, you know, as human beings. And it's true of everyone. Next slide, please. So hopefully, right, and our goal of what my training program is to build confidence in people, that when they see data, they feel confident that they have what it takes to be able to understand it. This is oftentimes, you know, the end result of building knowledge and skills, but there are people who are highly skilled and highly knowledgeable that actually lack this trait. And so then they second guess themselves maybe too often, or they don't feel confident to speak up in a meeting for one reason or another. But, you know, what good is that knowledge and those skills if our confidence, our lack of confidence, causes us to fail to participate or provide our perspective. So, you know, having that confidence, it's a key trait. And so highly data literate, just like highly articulate people are, you know, a novelist is confident enough to tell a story, a fictional story, and to write it down and to sell it. Were it not for that confidence, we wouldn't know about their amazing storytelling abilities. And so, you know, it is a core element of data literacy, is confidence to use what we have. Number 12 is all about alertness. And so working with data is very treacherous, isn't it? You know, there's so many opportunities to fail. And that sounds scary, and that might cause us to fail to have confidence. But ultimately, you know, being alert to the issues that might exist in the data set is an important aspect of data literacy. Errors abound, and so being alert to these common pitfalls people fall into in working with data, and we have an appreciation for these common mistakes. Okay, so next slide, please. This is a photograph of a sign of a trail not far from where I live here in Seattle, and it's talking about a sinkhole on the opposite side, just beyond the sign. There's a huge bowl in the ground. And evidently, if you step in that bowl, supposedly the sign is telling you that the ground might disappear. So that seems a little disturbing. And so I've never gone beyond that sign. I don't know that I ever will. But these signs are all around us in the real world to cause us to be alert to certain threats or risks that might cause us harm. But do we have that in the data world? Are there warning signs about the data that we're working with? Are there flags? Are there things that are showing us potential problems or not? If you advance to the next slide, please. So here's a data set from New York City, and I love it. What I love about it is that there's a dot way up. So when I showed the whole data, this is actually using one of the Mapbox background maps within Tableau. But you can see that it shows all these dots down here in the bottom there in New York. And then this is by zip code. And then there's a dot way up at the top up there. And so, you know, I was curious as to what that was. And what you don't see here because there's no slide build, but that zip code is 12345. So obviously, you know, this is probably just some data entry error or someone not knowing and just putting in 12345. And so, you know, we need to watch out for that. There's data entry issues like that, like we saw with the Baltimore towing data. We'll see those with almost every data set we come across. And so being alert to that, saying, okay, I need to be aware. If I didn't visualize it like this, I wouldn't have seen that zip code way off in the distance. And maybe I would have done some analysis based on zip codes that would have given me some faulty conclusion, perhaps. So next slide. So we need to be alert to things like that. Here's a bridge, just right, actually, very close to Tableau. In fact, Tableau, the headquarters, is just to the right of this bridge here in Fremont, in the neighborhood of Fremont of Seattle, where not far from where I live. The bridge goes up and down all day long. But if you go to the next slide, there's actually a bicycle counter on the top of that bridge, as you can see in this photograph right here. This little tower on the left-hand side with the number, the green number on it. What it's doing is it's counting bicycles as they cross, because the city Department of Transportation is interested in promoting bicycle ridership across the city. It helps with traffic, it helps with the environment, it helps with people's health in terms of fitness. And so, they're trying to promote that. So when I was looking, and the bridge counter data, it turns out, is available. Anybody can go download it, which I did before I was about to give a presentation at a luncheon one day, only about a mile away from the bridge. And I showed the bridge data on a line chart in the next slide to the people in the room. And I noticed that there was this huge spike right there. And so we were nobody really knew. I didn't either. I didn't know what caused it. So we were brainstorming, what do we think might have caused it? And people came up with ideas like maybe there was a race, or maybe there was a club, a bike club, or maybe it was bike to work day or something like that. And so later on, we found out, with a little bit of research in the next slide, that what caused the spike was a fault, an error, a malfunction in the bridge count, in the bicycle counter on the bridge. And so the people in the Department of Transportation in Seattle switched out the batteries, and these crazy spikes went away. And so you can see that a blogger was writing about it and said, Monday appears to smash the Fremont Bridge bike counter record. Update, probably not. And in the exchange there, in the second panel on the right, that's the back and forth emails between the blogger and the people in the city, where the person at the City Department of Transportation describes what was happening. And so, the point there is that, this is an aspect of the data. We weren't originally alert to the fact that it could have been a malfunction like that. None of our ideas about what was causing the spike included the possibility that it was simply a fault in the equipment itself. And that's something we do need to be alert to as well. Next slide, please. So these are attitudes again, and attitude is, so this is what this book here, Avoiding Data Pitfalls, is all about. I tried to come up with what I felt were really common blunders that I have made, I have seen others make, people who are novices, people who are experts alike. And it isn't like you stop making mistakes at some point in time. So therefore, it's just good to be alert to what they are. Next slide. All right, so I think in a lot of ways, we started working with data in corporate America, but we missed the ethical underpinnings or foundation of that. And so this is why we've seen so many headlines in the last few years about ethics breaches in data, privacy breaches, stolen data, companies using data in ways that are not fair or appropriate. And so, it doesn't really help us, does it, to be really, really good at working with data if all we do is use that for harm. And so we need to have an appreciation for what it means to be ethical when we work with data. And if you go to the next slide, it's an example of some news stories there. I was presenting in Houston and noted that Texas was really, really high in data breaches. And it's also a large state, so that's part of it too, right? Interestingly, but yeah, what are we doing to protect that data? What are government agencies doing? What are companies doing to protect their data? There's regulations in place to try to enforce that, but those regulations aren't always keeping up to date with the technology advances, or it takes some time for them to catch up, and that can result in people being, in some way, inconvenienced or worse based on the way data is treated. And that's so important, right? Why would we be great at data if all we did was put people in a bad position? We wouldn't want to do that. As a consumer, as a customer, we play that role too in our lives, don't we? Where others have our data, okay? In the companies we work in, we play the role where we have other people's data. So, we wouldn't want them to suffer in a way that, we wouldn't want to suffer if we were on the receiving end of an ethical breach. Next slide. So there's actually a great website out there called datapractices.org. Here's an example of a chart where I feel like it wasn't a very ethical treatment of data, because the smaller bar is the one that's large and overarching the other one. And so it's a little confusing there for people. And polling numbers, political polls are already so confusing for many people in the world. And so, why give it a graphical treatment that seems to give prominence to the smaller of the two? That would seem to be something that I wouldn't recommend we do. Next slide. So there's a website, as I was mentioning a moment ago, called datapractices.org. And it's essentially like a credo, if you will, or a manifesto. It's essentially saying, well, here are the things that we're going to seek to do as an organization. You can look at this and sign it if you're interested in adding your voice to it. And you can even use it at work or adopt it. You can take a look at it and say how it applies to you. And really, it's just saying, how do we hope to work with data effectively and in a fair way as teams? Things like presenting our work in ways that empowers others to make better informed decisions. Things like, building teams with diverse ideas. Things like protecting the privacy and security of individuals represented in our data. Those are things that I think, again, we missed those up front, and we need to go back now and do a better job of laying that foundation. On to the next one. So a great book about that. It's free. Actually, it's an ebook called Ethics in Data Science by DJ Patil, who was President Obama's chief data officer in the US federal government, also Hillary Mason and Mike Lukides. And so, they define the 5 C's of data ethics: consent, clarity, consistency, control, consequences. And so they talk about case studies, and I love it. They treat it in a way that isn't just moralizing it and wagging a finger at people that get it wrong. It's embracing it's fuzzy. It's not always clear what's the ethical thing to do. Sometimes we make a decision and we don't realize that it has a negative impact on someone until down the road, when this environment has changed, when the usage of a software code or data set has taken on a totally different use than the one we originally intended. And so how do we understand that? How do we give people and companies the power to raise the flag when there is an ethical issue that they have become aware of? And how do we protect those individuals from not being negatively impacted themselves? So an important topic. I think we're starting to scratch the surface of it. And companies need to go back, government agencies, nonprofits need to go back and make sure that they're applying ethics in a sound way. And this is such an important attitude when it comes to data, that we know that my attitude is I need to remember that ethics is critical, and it can make or break. I can do something great and make an amazing software application that at the end of the day is a scourge on people. Well, why would I want to do that? I wouldn't. Okay. Next slide. So next up, we talk about the last category. Behaviors are where the rubber hits the road. It's what you can count on someone to do day in and day out when they come into the work environment or engage in the community or in their own personal lives with their family and friends. What are the actions we can depend on them to do? So data literate people, let's go to the first one of these last category. These are individuals who, Cheryl Phillips. I chose Cheryl because she was at the Seattle Times for many years here in Seattle. She's now a professor at Stanford University in Northern California. And what I love about Cheryl, she's a really close friend of mine, but she is tenacious when it comes to gathering data. I'll never forget the time I got a phone call from her at about 8 p.m. one evening, and she called me, and I was at Tableau. I was running the Tableau public platform, and she was in the car on her way north to a bridge up in northern Washington, probably I would say about 2 or 2.5 hours from where I'm sitting right now. And the bridge had collapsed. And so she was driving up to the scene there and trying to research bridge data, structural soundness of bridges in the state of Washington. And so, just like I said, a tenacious journalist who would go to any lengths to get her hands on data to be able to tell a data story that she felt was going to help the public. Okay, so, but she also had this appreciation for the fact that there's effort involved there. We need to gather that data. Also, that the data could be missing or that it could be dirty and needs to be cleaned on or worked at. So next slide. So I love that, she's the quote for the behavior section. But here are the last few, right? One is that people utilize data resourcefully. So if you're a highly data literate individual in a company, you're actively seeking out and creating data as a means of gathering information. And then when there's data, you're bringing it to the surface and you're making sure that it's being put to use. It's one thing to have these rich data sets, and what if they don't ever get touched? What if that's not a resource that people know to tap into? So a highly data literate individual is seeking out and putting those data sources to use. If there's tools at their disposal, they find out how to use them and they make the most of what they've got. you know, and you change environments, you change jobs or companies, your resources are going to change. Well, you adapt, and you're a person who is deciding no matter what, like Churl for the Seattle Times, you know, I'll do whatever it takes, right, to use data in an effective way. Next slide. But because we know data is not perfect, there's the need to continuously improve it. Maybe we need to add to it or clean it. When we see an error, we don't just shrug and walk away. We say, well, hey, let's fix that. And then let's improve the system that created it so that those sorts of errors are less likely to be included in the future. If we see a dashboard that has a chart type that's very misleading or confusing, we, you know, kind of in an effective and in a, I guess the word would be like a gracious or kind way, we work with individuals to make improvements so that some of those issues might not be there anymore. Okay, so continuous improvement. Data is never perfect. We need to keep working at it. People who are highly data literate, they come in every day and they find ways to improve, invest in improving the data tools, the data itself, the conversation and how we discuss the data in our teams. And they're continuing to find ways to improve that data. Next slide. So only a couple more to go here, right? So one, these are behaviors. Oh, I was just calling attention to in the 15th slide there that we need to continuously improve all kinds of data, not just data in our jobs, in the professional context in which we work, also our personal data. What about health and fitness? How are you tracking your own life? How are you tracking how you're thriving? You know, what inputs are you using? Also in our public data with our cities and our towns and our nations and the globe and the world itself, are we taking and collecting better data about this environment that we are entrusted with for the short time we're here? And then clearly in the proprietary or professional context as well, how are we improving the data of the companies we work for? But it isn't just about the companies we work for. Tableau Public taught me that. And I love that about Tableau Public is that we apply all these skills and abilities we have, this data literacy we develop. We apply that to our neighborhoods, to our families, to our nations. Because if it's just about our jobs and about making the company that is paying us get bigger and bigger and bigger, well, that would be a shame if we just left it at that, I think. I think that that would be leaving a lot of, maybe even leaving the better parts of our contribution while we're here. It would be leaving it out. You know, if we just thought of our data skills as things we do in our jobs, that's it. I think we're leaving too much out of the equation there, in my opinion. Next slide here, number 16, the 16th trait coming in, last two. So someone who, as we talked about that road from awareness to adoption, right? So someone who is highly data literate effectively advocates for data. So we're all sitting around a meeting room, we're talking about a decision we need to make as a team. Then there's that one person in the team that says, you know what, I think there's actually some data that we can use here. What if we looked at, and they go on to advocate for including data in the discussion, in the decision. And so I like to work with people like that. I appreciate those individuals. I aspire to be like that, where I'm asking, wait a minute, what's the data angle here? How can we use data to inform our decision? Maybe we're checking our gut or instinct, or maybe we're just gathering information about something that we just really don't have any idea. And so, you know, what's the latest and greatest method we could apply to advocating for data? In the next slide, I think we're going to see here, if I'm not mistaken, yeah, this is this journey I was talking about, right? Because what happens is the journey of adoption starts at awareness and then it goes to adoption. In the next slide, though, I think it should hopefully, if it's, unless it was a build, yeah, there we go, good. It becomes a journey of advocacy. So once you adopt and you become proficient and you continue to put good use into play, into practice, then eventually that in and of itself advocates, but then also you're actively promoting the usage of data in a way that's helpful for everyone else. Because to wrap it all up here, and this is the last point that I'll make in the 17th trait, and thanks for hanging in there with me nice and late on your Friday night, but it's all about enthusiastically spreading data literacy. So we're using the analogy of a language, aren't we, when we talk about literacy? Well, if you've ever learned a foreign language, when I was growing up in Southern California as a teenager, I learned Spanish. And, you know, I learned it in books in classrooms, and that's fine. But I didn't really learn it until I was going to a church in Los Angeles that spoke Spanish exclusively, and then going to Central America to spend a bit of my summer 1 year with families who only spoke Spanish. And so it's when you're around people that are putting it to good use that you become yourself more proficient, right? More fluent. And it's the same with data. The more we surround ourselves with people who are enthusiastically making great use of it, that's going to be infectious. It's going to spread to us. And then we'll carry on that same message to others as well, that we encourage them to learn and grow. And we teach them through our actions, through our conversation. And this is a way that we spread data literacy from person to person in our communities, in our companies, in the teams we work, and even in our families. So like any language, the language of data thrives and spreads with effective use and refinement. And data literate individuals spread data literacy through active and competent use of the language. Right? So to wrap it up here, and then I'll have a few moments for questions if you'd like. I talked about at the beginning being a hiker, being a backpacker. And so it's something that I was actually very afraid of at first. I'll never forget the first time I went on the trail with my kids with a little map. I didn't know where we were going, and I was worried that we were lost, and I was worried that I was going to be able to get them home safely. And I didn't know what was out there. I'd never been there before, and it was felt very like unnatural to me. It felt very foreign and threatening as I started. I think that's normal when we start anything. But eventually, as you continue and you apply yourself, you start to become more comfortable. You start to become more proficient in that skill, in that tool, in that activity. Okay, and then you start to advocate it. So here I am, talking all about it to you. When someone comes into town, oftentimes I ask them, would they like to go on trails? And so I'm bringing them into this activity and walking with them and letting them know where we're going and telling them all about it and helping them understand what they need to do, what kind of shoes they need to wear, right? So now I'm essentially like evangelizing in a way, if you think about it. It's not a religion, but it's something that I'm passionate about. Same thing with Tableau, same thing with data. What you do is as you become familiar with it and confident, you start to spread it. You start to talk about it. You start to tell other people about it. And then people grow. People also grow along with you. So this is effective spreading of a language. Last slide at the bottom here. So there you go. There's the 17 key traits broken up into knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors. There they all are kind of together. There's 4 knowledge, 5 skills, and then 4 attitudes and behaviors. And that rounds out the 17. I don't think that these are the only 17. I think there's 18. I think there's 19. There's many other types of traits. This is just my starting point. So I wouldn't present this to you as like the only 17 key traits. There's 17 key traits that I'm aware of now, and that's going to continue to evolve. If you go to the next slide, I've created a little assessment. I'll send a link to Cigar so we can distribute it. But it allows you to do your own assessment, your own self-assessment of where are you in your proficiency in each of these 17 traits, as well as how important is it for you in your current environment. And then that'll help you kind of put it on a 4-grid, four kind of blocker there, if you will. And you'll be able to look at ones in which it's important for you, but your skill is low. That becomes your key kind of professional development focus area. So I'll send that link out. This is a Tableau public dashboard that anybody can go use. It's out there on the web for free. And then last but not least, I'll wrap it up just by saying thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties at the beginning. Thank you, Cigar, for being so gracious to walk me through all these slides here and to stick with me and advance through them one by one. I hope this was helpful to you. You can get this ebook on my site if you just go to dataliteracy.com and you scroll down. There's a little place where you can click on a link there to go. I think you need to provide your email address, and then you can go to download the ebook yourself. And yeah, data literacy. Thank you. Sure. Missing an R in there. Yeah, E-R-A-C-Y. Thank you. Yep, one more over.
Oh.
See, it's not just me having technical difficulties. It's so hard to type, isn't it? Yeah, thank you. There you go. Data literacy. I should hopefully. I wonder, actually. I'm going to find out how. High up I am. Ooh, I'm too far down. I got to work on that.
Just
Dataliteracy.com.
um,
If you scroll to the bottom of that page, there you go. Pop up here in a minute.
yeah.
There you go. If you go to the bottom of this page, you'll see a little blue bar right there. Keep going a little farther down. There you go. Yep. So that's just a ebook you can get in your inbox right there. Just put your name and email address in there, and it'll show up in your inbox there within an hour or so. Actually, below that too is a little checklist I've created for avoiding data pitfalls. So even though the book's not available to ship in India, just up a little bit, that one right there. Yeah, you can get a checklist of those pitfalls and a little guide that goes along with it, and you can get that now, and that's for free as well. So happy to kind of provide some of those hopefully helpful materials to you all on your data journey. Just like a hike in the mountains of Seattle, I hope it's a journey to a higher place, one that gives you some amazing experiences, one that helps you connect with other people on the same journey like me. And so would love to connect with you about that in the future. So thank you to Cigar for the chance to present. And again, thanks for helping me with the slides and with the technical difficulties. And appreciate everyone who stayed late on a Friday night there in India. If you're watching the recording, I hope you enjoyed it as well. Please feel free to reach out at any time. You can find me on LinkedIn, Ben Jones. Ben R. Jones is the website there on LinkedIn, as well as on Twitter at Data Remixed, or you can just send me a note there by finding my contact information on my website, dataliteracy.com. And it was a pleasure. So thanks much. Any questions at all? Or I know we're probably a little overtime because of that challenge at the beginning to get started. So happy to wrap it up there unless anyone has any questions.
First of all, thanks a lot, Ben. I think it was a great session. I think a little thought-provoking how exactly we can teach people more about data literacy. I think this is one challenge I'm facing right now in India. I think that will really help me to basically talk to my clients about it. So yeah, thanks a lot for that. I'm just checking if someone has a question. Maybe Sia or Divya, if you guys want to talk something to Ben.
I liked it a lot, Ben. Thank you for the presentation. I'm actually not based in India, but in Europe, so I would look forward to maybe invite you to one of my customer webinars if you're up for it. I
Oh,
just sent you
absolutely. Sure. I'd love to. Yeah.
invitation.
Why don't we connect afterward? I'd love to do that. Whereabouts are you in Europe, Sia?
Germany, Frankfurt.
Oh, excellent. Okay. I've been there actually. Well, yeah. So I've been to the Tableau. I'm imagining it's a lot bigger than when I was there a few years ago. It was growing so
Yeah.
fast. So, yeah. Would you do me a favor? Would you say hello to Florian for me if you see him anytime soon?
It's very rarely in our office. I
Okay.
haven't
Yeah.
seen him in a long time.
Next time he's around, let him know that I said hello. Yeah, he and I worked together on the Tableau public platform there for many years. So I think he'll be out here in February too for the marketing kickoff meeting. But yeah, great
Will do.
to meet you, and would be happy to jump on a webinar with your customers sometime. If you want to reach out to me, we can coordinate that.
Cool.
Great. All right, thanks everyone. I really appreciate giving me the chance to present this material, and yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and happy holidays, happy New Year to you all. And I'm looking forward to 2020 being a great one for all of us for data literacy. So take care, everyone.
Thank you, Ben, and same to you. Have a great New Year, have a great Christmas, and happy holidays to you as well. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Absolutely. Same.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Divya. Bye.